I know it's really overwhelming to remember that you've lost your parent, or that you've lost a relationship, or that you moved away from a home and that home no longer exists for you to even reference or go back and visit. Those moments of denial allow us to gently handle ourselves and to softly start to ask questions and integrate things. And I think that that alone is where we get it wrong with grief. When we try to force someone into moving on, quote unquote, and get back on our timeline so that we can have their effective actions or investment in life, right? That's a capitalist mentality that says, if you aren't producing, then you're not useful, or you're not worthy, or you're not important enough to have around. And I think the opposite is completely true. I think if you are not producing anything, then you are in fact creating an atmosphere of rest.
You are now listening to the highlight reel builder for authors, the Going North podcast. I'm your host, best-selling author, and Maxwell Leadership Certified Trainer, DomBrightmon. And you're going to be getting some tips and techniques to advance yourself coming up next. Today's episode is sponsored by both books, Going North, Tips and Techniques to Advance Yourself, and the follow-up bestseller, Stay the Course, The Elite Performer's 7 Secret Keys to Sustainable Success. Head over to Amazon.com, pick up both books. They are available in a trifecta of paperback, audio, and ebook. Cop all three of both and be on the lookout for another book from yours truly to help podcasters succeed. Now let's get on with today's episode. And today on the Highlight Reel Builder for Authors, known as GMP, the Great, Glorious, and Glamorous, is the Going North podcast. And we got another super special, awesome guest that could probably fit all three of those G's and more, baby, a dig, because she hails from the mightypodmatch.com, baby. That's right, indeed, where podcast guests get to connect with podcast hosts. And if they're cool, they're freaking in. And today's guest is cooler than 3 cucumbers. Let me tell you a bit about it, because not only is she a fellow bookcaster, because she has published a book and she runs a wonderful podcast of her own. She's also a speaker as well as a certified trauma-informed Enneagram and grief educator, indeed, all the way from the West Side. So let's give it up for the main character herself, the MC, the one and only Mandy Capehart. How you doing today, Mandy?
Dom, I'm so happy to be with you today. I love that you said MC. I think that's the funniest thing about my initials, and nobody ever lets me have that joke. So thank you.
That's right, dude. She's the MC on the mic, busting the rhymes, main character. Like, dude, there's at least 2 opportunities. Like, how can you not take advantage and relish it? That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. If I'm not mistaken, a mom and a wife too on top of it.
I am.
Right.
Yeah, I've got a little girl. I've got a puppy that's basically an extra child, and I'm married. So really, it's just a household that I try not to run by myself all the time.
Yeah. Teamwork makes the dream work, and it takes a village.
Yeah.
Yep. That's right, indeed. Sometimes it takes a village with the village.
That's where I'm at the moment, and it's no shade to my family. They're amazing, but it's just the adjustments of the new year. It's how it works out sometimes.
That's right, indeed. Name of the game: New Year, say me.
Pretty much.
Oh man, but it ain't just about the excitement of the new year. As with all introductions, they're not allowed to be 195 days long, and I probably only covered maybe Windows 95 of it, which was probably like 95 seconds of what all of Mandy has to offer. So since it's your first time on the show, mind giving the folks listening around the magical earth a little bit of your backstory of how you became the Mandy that you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. I started working in grief actually officially in 2020. We were just talking about how COVID gave us all this space. This pandemic gave us space to stay home and really singly focus on what mattered. And in that time, I had been experiencing the grief of my mother, who died in 2016, my grandfather 2 years prior to that, and so many losses prior to that I actually just lost count. And so when the pandemic started, I realized I just didn't want to continue living in a world that lacked grief literacy and misunderstood the way that we actually can support each other and process our healing that we need without minimizing or shutting it down or just distracting ourselves. So I spent that time writing a book. It's a 31-day guidebook on my story and also processing grief from the intersection of faith and loss, where I was sitting very strongly and realizing that the church didn't have anything for me, that they didn't necessarily have any equipment or understanding of how to do it well without asking me to come along quickly and get back to leading or teaching. And so the transformation that has happened in my life in the last 3 years has that I have gone very full ham into grief coaching and supporting people through my podcast, through one-on-one coaching, through individual or group grief coaching, just privately and with different companies as well lately. So that's pretty much what occupies like 98% of my time.
Yeah. There we go. From Windows 95 to Windows 98. You love to see it. That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. And full ham. So that means she doesn't have to cut the end of the ham like that good old story of generations. Let the small hands. That's right, indeed. And that's why I always ask guests to fill in cavities, because you're also a fellow child of the king. So how did that come about? What's your salvation testimony? I always invite fellow believers to share that on the podcast.
Well, to be honest, it's been a very long journey in my life. Like I was raised Lutheran and did all the Bible school things. I sang in the choirs and I was actually a worship leader for 16 years until 2018, 2019, when I stepped down. And a lot of that really happened because my faith didn't show up in the way that they promised that it would when I was facing the greatest losses of my life. And so working through grief and just an understanding of faith that's more expansive and more liberation minded gave me the opportunity to really embrace what can be true and what is impossible to know, and to lean into impermanence in a way that makes space for both myself to transform, to be transformed, to experience faith practices in a way that I haven't in the past, and to become curious in a way that allows for integration of new things and new understanding. So I went from being a 5-year-old at Bible camp, accepting the Lord over a hot dog conversation, to being a former worship leader who is hell bent on changing how the church handles grief.
There we go. That's right. Making them more grief literate. That's right, indeed. Taking them from anorexia to a waistline of a sumo wrestler plus Mount Fuji. You love to see it. That's right, indeed. That's right. Making sure that faith expands, indeed. And yeah, definitely. And I love the fact that you put the two words together, grief literate, because the thing is, everybody handles grief differently in so many different ways. And sorry again for the loss of your lovely family, the mom, and of course the
Thank you.
grandfather and everybody else, because it's been, wow, almost 7 years now, but it hits different. Like I've even heard, and sometimes it can be true that sometimes they say time heals all wounds. Well, nah, after the first year, sometimes it gets worse, sadly.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Typically they don't put timelines. We don't put timelines on grief. I will say people do, but I don't. And yet within those first 2 years of a loss, especially connected to a death, but any type of loss, it really gets murky. And we have those moments where we feel like, oh, we're returning to some sense of normalcy, or we're understanding a new sense of normal. And then we spiral right back down into the beginning stages like it happened yesterday. So it can take 2 years. In my experience, it did. At 2 years, I was very surprised that all of a sudden I felt very light and very different and very present in a way that my questions didn't need answers anymore. My questions needed to be asked and needed a witness to bear time and invest in my experience of healing and what that might look like for me and what might be meaningful. And so, yeah, it'll be 7 years in a couple of weeks, actually. And I hate it. I hate it so much. January is really hard because there are a lot of grief anniversaries this month for me. And so I'm recognizing that 7 years in, I can tread differently and be really kind with myself, and also use that again to inform the work that I'm doing with other people and how they can become more supportive for their community too.
Definitely right indeed. So, any recommendations for first steps? Because sometimes I guess folks can come up and say the wrong thing outside of my condolences or sorry for your loss. And I guess in our case, some folks might be like, lost. Oh no, they're in heaven.
Yeah. I'm going to hit that second thing you said first, because the idea of loss at the church is really, really complicated. A friend of mine a few years ago, she's younger than me, early 30s, died after being ill for a while, but being very secretive about it. They were
Oh,
really careful and very guarded and very coming out of a Pentecostal church charismatic atmosphere. There was very much a denial of illness. There was a lot of language about prayer warriors and raising up your swords and fighting on behalf of, while all the denying her dying process, denying her experience, whether she believed she was dying or believed she would be healed or believed that she would come through this on the other side alive. It didn't matter. There was no access for, from where I was sitting, her permission to actually grieve what was happening and be present with it, let alone the rest of us. And so I remember being at her service and being so, I mean, sitting in the back with my arms crossed, like in the corner, trying so hard not to stand up and just shake the person speaking and saying, how dare you? How dare you minimize the pain in this room by saying, but God? It is not about dismissing God. It's not about dismissing the reality of our faith practices or what we believe, but the way that you have used what you've believed to minimize the reality around us breaks the ability for faith to ever become an integrative part of healing for everyone here. Because the more they start to question, you're so afraid that those questions will shatter their understanding or their confidence in their faith if they're not allowed to grieve fully. What weakness is that faith? My faith practice has only become stronger because I was allowed in my own time to strip it away. And I say allowed because um, I gave myself permission rather than holding on to what I had permission from other people. But that's actually a lot of what my book is about, because where I started and in my faith practice was at the intersection of grief and faith, to say, okay, well, I have nothing left. I took 1 week after my mom died immediately to do all of the traditional, this is what you need to take care of to wrap up finances and funeral details and transportation and belongings. And then at the end of that seventh day, I just said, all right, Lord, I am either 100% in and I'm going to try to understand what happened here, or I'm out and I can't do it anymore. And I'm not a person who can give up. I will admit that things fall apart and things fail, but if I haven't put 100% into it to prevent that or to try and understand first, then it's not a failure to me. It's just I didn't participate. So I have not walked away from my faith. I have walked very far to the edge. And I got to a point where I just said, you know what? I can't handle everybody's platitudes and scriptural references and these encouragements that have no context for my story. I'm going to step back from everything, strip it all down and say, okay, well, I have Jesus. What do I have there? What is true about who Jesus is and was and is trying to be in my life that I can recognize as my own process of becoming while I pursue this healing experience? And so for those who are involved in faith practices, that's my first piece of advice, is to strip everything down and to stop with the platitudes, not running to scripture to say like, oh, okay, I'm okay because there is an afterlife. I'm okay because I believe this is true of scripture, because your theology falls apart when you look so closely at it and you find the incongruence with your grief experience, right? And your lived experience. Specifically, like, as I said, I was in a charismatic church and the laying on of hands for prayer and healing was active and daily, right? I had experienced that when I was in college. Someone laid hands on me and I was healed from something and it was incredible. And so I had this understanding that if I will just lay hands on my mom, she'll be healed. Well, I didn't do it because she was also contagious. And if I would have touched her, there was a very high chance that I could have caused her death further to spiral like quickly by transmitting germs, and vice versa, that I could have caught something she was carrying. So I was terrified. And I blamed myself for years afterwards, thinking like, how weak was my faith that I didn't feel protected, that I wouldn't crush the heel of the snake in that moment by touching and know that I can, be protected. all of the scriptures that are just only half pieces of them that come rushing back in those moments of regret. And that alone was enough to absolutely sink my faith. Where I went from that was the ability to step back and say, okay, but wait a minute, what would Jesus, like the silly what would Jesus do thing that wasn't even where I was going with it. It was, what does Jesus say about life? What does Jesus say about death? What is true that is coming for all of us? Death. Is it true that we will be protected and no one will have a painless death? No, it's not. Like, none of us will have a painless death necessarily. Doesn't matter if what kind of pain we're carrying, right? And so as I began to just admit that those promises of prosperity and wholeness and perfect, happy little life were not true, it allowed me to really lean into the grief process differently. So strip it down. That's my advice. And that's true even if you're not in a faith community and you're experiencing grief, because the same thing is true of, you can create a faith practice out of anything that you hold as really valuable. Any kind of framework that you have put on a pedestal can be a downfall if you give it too much credit. And so the same thing is true with grief. We've got this idea that it's linear, that there's 5 steps, that there's a framework, that someone's got a book somewhere that I can just read and then process and I'm good. And I've read all of the books. I won't say I've read all of the books. I've read most of the books, many of the books, and it doesn't do, that's not what they're for. They are jumping off points. They are little tiny wrecking balls that as you read them, you realize that you've had some things completely wrong or completely right. And sometimes that can turn into criticizing our own grief process or judging the way that we're approaching things. And the reality is that's not the case. We can't grieve wrong. We have to strip down what we think is the expectation of how to grieve and give ourselves permission to create meaning where we need it so that we can actually integrate and heal. There's your long answer.
There we go. That's right indeed. The wiener dogs are happy. That's right indeed. That's right indeed. Hashtag meaningful Mandy. That's right indeed. Because yeah, definitely, and the whole stripping down piece, especially when folks actually take a look at the actual book, it some of the things we say don't always align with it. So you're so right about that. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah. Like,
Yeah.
it's like, hey, if it works, it works, but not for everybody though.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely, especially that piece, that definitely makes it probably even more heartbreaking with what happened of having that healing experience and hoping that the same would happen for you. But it's like you can't
Mm-hmm.
even touch the person, lay the hands
Yeah.
of healing on them because it's like, oh crap, like I might die in the process here, make it worse. It's like, oh crap, and just having to live with that, let alone all these years. Still, I'm sure there's still some painful memories of that, sadly, and it's so
Yeah.
right. It's like sometimes you just have to sometimes just hear folks out, just give them a listening ear if they so desire that listening ear to help them with that issue indeed. So definitely sorry once again you had to go through that and still dealing with the aftermath of it indeed. Definitely a heavy cross to carry. Definitely a heavy cross to carry.
Mm.
So my goodness. So reading a bunch of the books and trying to get a few more answers or at least jumping off points to where you can trampoline into something else, some higher ground to get out of the metaphorical drowning, ended up decided to put pen to paper and join the metaphorical business of immortality by publishing a book of your own. So how was that process like, especially
Mm.
with the topic?
It was complicated. So I was homeschooling my daughter at the time. It was right after the pandemic shut down everything and processing my own anxiety about the pandemic and whatnot. And yet it came very naturally. So I decided to frame it out in the 5 steps of grief simply because they're familiar and people recognize them. So it would make the work more approachable. But I self-published. So I intentionally said, well, I could sit with this and try to get it published traditionally, or I could know that I did this for the purpose of helping people create literacy in their communities, including my own grief faith community at the time. So I'm just going to go after this in the way that I need to do it. I will edit this myself. I'll design all of it myself and just self-publish it through Amazon, which is what I ended up doing. Very hard process, exhausting process. Like I have a background in journalism and editing. Like writing is easy. Even the editing was fine. I read through the thing like 4 or 5 times and paid a friend who's also an editor to do the same, but I did everything by myself. So if you're not, if you can bring other people in, there's no reason to do it all yourself. So like the practical side of
Yeah.
it was tiresome. I was tired, but it's also like this incredible piece of artwork and permanence that I do have, that I can say, like, I did this. I created this beauty in my life that has created meaning for me outside of all of these horrific losses that I've experienced. And I wouldn't change anything. I don't want a publisher that I'm beholden to with this book. Like the next one, yeah, sure, call me. But on this one, it was so personal, and it ended up being something that I was able to immediately implement while I was still finishing the editing process. Because the fall of 2020, there was a wildfire in our town that took out 2,500 homes. And
Ooh.
in the aftermath of that, our church community ended up, we own a very large building. And so they ended up being a hub of like donations and resources for people who'd lost their homes. But I then decided this is the time. Like, I have to try this now, or I'm not going to pursue this as a career. Like, is what I'm creating for anyone but me? And I launched the Restorative Grief Project, which is just an online free coaching group to just be available to bear witness, like you said, as someone who doesn't have answers, but is willing to ask questions with you while you're grieving. And it became so meaningful and so well received that my individual coaching practice launched right after that. And to this day, half of my clients are fire survivors who are still finding great support, not just in me, but in this reality that the way we approach grief can be individualized in a way that doesn't just put the pressure on us as individuals to figure it out on our own, but in a way that we can partner with someone who can help guide them toward what would be meaningful, toward how to determine what we find meaningful when what we thought was meaningful is what we've lost.
Uh, that's right indeed. That's right indeed. That restorative grief indeed. That's right indeed. Congrats on making it through. So hearing you mention now the process was hard. Yeah, it was hard. Yeah. You did the formatting yourself for the book, didn't you?
Mm-hmm. Every bit of it, designed all of it, all the writing, all the edits. There was only one mistake in the final copy that I finally had a chance to upload the edit, but it was a mistake in a piece of poetry that I'd written. So no one else could have caught it but myself, because it was a piece so I found it and I was just so upset. I'm like, the whole cadence is off with that one word missing, but I will fix it. And no one else noticed. So either they skipped that part or it was just as effective.
Yeah, probably just as effective. It's like, oh god, like, yeah, outsource the final product of your book.
Mm-hmm.
Don't try to do the typesetting, interior formatting, especially if you try to use the Microsoft Word. It's like needles to the eyes. Like, oh
It took
god.
me, it took me at least a month and a half of trying not to smash my laptop to get it right. And exporting to PDF and embedding fonts and all the little things you don't think about, and then licensing. And I'm like, okay, it's fine. It's done. I'll never do it again. We're good.
Yeah, it's like borderline PTSD thinking
Yeah.
about it. So my goodness, and the thing is, what I've come to find out about grief, it's not only just loved ones; it could be possible situations too, like the grief of the time loss of putting
Mhm.
your first book out to the world. So my goodness, so with the grief counseling and all that wonderful smooth jazz that help folks to feel a little bit more jazzy after a while of your coaching. Like, my goodness. So what do folks get wrong about grief altogether?
That it's a monolith, that if someone is grieving, that we have to look the same, or that we have to express it in a single way or a specific way. Otherwise, we're not grieving correctly. I alluded to this earlier, that you can't grieve in a wrong way. And you'll find people that argue with that, to say, yes, you can absolutely grieve incorrectly. You could grieve by not grieving. You can grieve by drinking too much, and that's the wrong way to do it. And where I have found that language fails is the moment I say, hey, that's not the right way to do it, shame enters the conversation. And shame is the lowest form of transformation. It's the lowest motivator that we have. And of course it works because nobody wants to feel ashamed. No one wants to feel badly about how they're experiencing their life or processing their growth. Instead of saying, well, this is a good way or this is a bad way, or this is the right and that's the wrong way, I've started working with people to change the language to this is a healthy, helpful way, and this is an unhelpful or unhealthy way to process your grief. Because our coping mechanisms that we use are gifts. They are truly internal ways of our brain, our body integrating what is too much in a way that we can actually tolerate and survive it. So denial, right? That first step of grief where everyone says, well, this can't be possible. Denial also happens 20 years down the road where we still don't realize I just picked up the phone to call my mom and she's been gone for 20 years. How is that possible? And denial comes back to the forefront, not because we're naive and disconnected from reality, but because our brain is saying, hey, it's okay. I know it's really overwhelming to remember that you've lost your parent or that you've lost a relationship or that you moved away from a home and that home no longer exists for you to even reference or go back and visit. Those moments of denial allow us to gently handle ourselves and to softly start to ask questions and integrate things. And I think that that alone is where we get it wrong with grief. When we try to force someone into moving on, quote unquote, and get back on our timeline so that we can have their effective actions or investment in life, right? That's a capitalist mentality that says if you aren't producing, then you're not useful or you're not worthy or you're not like important enough to have around. And I think the opposite is completely true. I think if you are not producing anything, then you are in fact creating an atmosphere of rest. If you are bringing yourself to a place where you can sit, that's liberation. That's freedom from the expectation that you have to perform grief or that you have to have a specific outcome in order to say, checked the box, totally grieved today, no big deal. Because I mean, I don't know about you, but anyone I know that has grieved will say, I was doing just fine in my estimation. And then all of a sudden, this tidal wave came and I felt like I was back at day one. Well, that's because you are allowing yourself to grieve. There's no ability to like sit down and force yourself to grieve. You can sit down and journal, you can do activities, you can do any of these restorative practices that invite that vulnerability where grief can express itself in your life. But the reality is you can't schedule that. So you can't schedule the grief actually surfacing. And so when we think that we can formulaically move through loss, we have given ourselves a great discredit. It's a disservice to our complexity as humans and our ability to hold so many incongruous concepts in our mind that we no longer recognize what healing looks like. So that's what I think we get wrong.
That's right indeed. It's not the mighty monolith, y'all. That's right indeed. It ain't no mighty monolith indeed. Grief is grief for different folks with different strokes. That's right indeed. That's right indeed. It's so true because hey, you can't really schedule grief. That would probably make it a lot easier if you could, but it's just
Yeah.
not going to happen. I can remember even in with my dad back in 2017, he passed, and the
Mhm.
week after, like that whole week, fully energized, getting things done, getting prepared with the funeral and everything, and
Yeah.
then took about a good two, yeah, I think it was 2, 3 weeks. Had to wait for the funeral since he was a veteran, and he had a plot in the veteran cemetery, and then next thing I know, the funeral happens that Monday, that March. And then next thing I know, I wake up the day after, I got a pounding headache. And I'm like, crap, I got to go to freaking work today. Like, what the hell? And I was able to drink some water to be able to get the headache down. I guess that was a dehydration headache, I guess. And
Well,
out of
tears will
nowhere,
do that.
yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's insane. It's insane. It hits you in so many different ways. You can't schedule it indeed. Definitely can't schedule it. So my goodness. So what's been some of your things to do to help you with, I guess, getting your mind on different things since that loss is going to be there always.
Yeah. I think for me, I've learned it's less about leaning into or leaning away from distractions and more about recognizing when they're a useful tool and when they're not. So one of the things that when I was younger, I would work so hard, go so hard that when like holidays would come along, I would get sick every time because I finally am stopping. I'm finally like resting and my body says, okay, good, we can drop the guard. And I noticed the other day, other than having COVID because of a work trip I had to go on, I haven't been sick. And it's not like I've lived in a cave. We were very careful in our house and masking, but I really haven't been. And that's even in between going from working really hard or taking and then, having a break. And I reflected back on why that might be because it's not, I mean, around me right now, I don't know about where you are, but there are so many cases of COVID not being as intense as the cold that people are having or the cough or the strep that's coming through our city. And they're sick for months on end.
Yeah.
The difference being I've recognized that as I've gone through this grief process, I'm giving myself permission to say, like, well, you know what I notice? My body is keeping track of the pain. Like you said, you woke up with a headache. I'm like, there'll be days when I'm like, what's that shoulder pain? Yes, I've lived with shoulder pain for a long time because I'm a crazy person who will lift too much weight or work too hard and sit at my desk all day and then not stretch or not work out for the day, not take care of myself. But if I know that I'm nourishing my body typically, then when that pain creeps in, I can ask some different questions about it. And so the work that we do in the Restorative Grief Project has taken on that form. We look at ourselves as whole beings, heart, mind, body, and spirit. Spirit being the way we connect to people, to connect to ourselves, connect to our understanding of faith and the world at large. Our body, obviously, the somatic feelings we're carrying, our emotional selves in our heart, and our thought selves in our mind. And grief takes all four of those areas and throws them out of alignment, right? Well, the only way to bring those things back into alignment is to know like what values we're aligning them with, what matters to us, what is meaningful, and how do we decide, oh, I'm out of alignment with my values and what means something to me. In that place, there are days when I can say, ooh, I'm out of alignment with my value of rest. Guess what we're doing? We're going to sit down and we're going to binge our favorite show on Hulu and we're not going to apologize for it. And if someone says, what are you doing? Are you okay? We're going to be like, absolutely, I'm living my best life. And not just because I'm avoiding all of the things that I don't want to deal with that are hard. I have cultivated and I help people cultivate their own capacity to deal with what is hard, even if it's in 1 minute segments every other day, right? We start as small as we need to. But I also know that I am cultivating my capacity to rest because as someone who is in a capitalistic productivity driven society where efficiency is valued over emotional capacity, I have become this person who decides, well, I actually don't care if I disappoint someone because I'm not producing for them. If that changes the trajectory of my entire life, I will get on board with that. And I will recognize that who I am today is healthier than who I was yesterday, submitting to that need for efficiency. So that means today, healthy me is happier, even though it's costing me something because everything costs us something. I get to choose now as I'm working toward healing that my whole self is what I will not compromise. I'm not going to compromise my health, heart, mind, body, or spirit anymore. And so I think that approach to grief work has really invited this ability to say to other people as well, like, hey, there's a lot of permission for you here to move as slowly as you need to. There's a lot of grace for you when you feel like you've made mistakes in the grief process to recognize, well, actually, those mistakes are also part of the process. Because anybody who's telling you, I have the answers and I have figured it out is full of crap. And they are trying very hard to convince themselves that that's the case too. So I say the same thing to myself. Like when I think, oh, I figured out a good way for processing grief, my entire being is like, you want to bet? You want to bet? Would you put money on that? Because I guarantee there will be something that I hear or that I experience or that I say that I'm like, oh, that was ugly. That was not the highest self that I'm calling my heart and my mind and my body in connection into. So where have I come out of alignment with my values? And maybe are my values different in this season? Because that's true too. They change. Gosh, they can change daily. And so the ability to stay flexible within the grief process, I think, is really crucial for our healing, even if it means that what worked yesterday is completely ineffective for us today.
Oh yeah, that's right indeed. Values can change. Today's healthy version of yourself can change. It's like, well, actually, by default, if you're blessed to live a long life, it's gonna change. It's like, it's a good day. The check engine light didn't pop on. I didn't have a encounter with Uncle Artie. Hooray!
Yeah.
It's like, yep, things will change. It's like, hey, just being okay with, hey, things are gonna change. It's part of being human, part of living. It's like a lot of things change and just have to flow with it and then go with it. Indeed. And speaking of change and flow, you're a fellow bookcaster, Minnie. You not only got this marvelous book, you got a podcast too. So that means I got to ask one of those obligatory podcast hosting questions. So, what are the three major lessons you learned from starting and growing your magnificent podcast?
You know what's funny is my show is so different from a lot of the shows I listen to. It's got a interview and then essay format, so back and forth, right? So there's long form, there's short form. Humility slapped me in the face very quickly. I love talking with strangers. I love like just saying, "Hi, I'm super intense and I have really scary questions. Are you willing to be vulnerable with me?" And like some of my closest friends are people that I've sat across the table from and said, "So tell me, like, what's your darkest secret?" And they're like, "Oh, that's a fun icebreaker." I'm like, "No, no, no. Like, what is it? Does it hurt? Can I work with you? Like, who are you? I want to know who you are." So humility in that not everybody has capacity for those questions right off the bat, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that I'm doing a bad job, that I found the wrong guests, that I have that I'm making mistakes. It means that I'm learning and growing and I'm bringing people along with me. Let's see, what else have I learned podcasting? There will be times when nobody gives a shit about grief and nobody wants to talk about it. And that's completely natural and it's okay. As much as I would love to talk about it all day, every day, and help people find ways to integrate grief literacy and new understanding in their lives, it's just not where people are at a lot of the time. So I'm reminding myself I don't have to convince people that what I'm producing or what I'm creating is meaningful. It will be meaningful for them when they're ready for it to be meaningful. And until then, it's meaningful to me. It's helping me heal and grow. And let's see, the third lesson, I think that everyone's voice is really important. It can be easy to focus on the polished voices or the ones who can present themselves really well and say like, "Oh, you seem like you've got your story figured out." But then you realize, well, that person actually tells the exact same story everywhere they go. Not to discredit their story, but that's not the authentic voice that I'm looking for to help encourage people to allow their authentic grief stories to come to the surface. And so I think just the pursuit of a real authenticity, which sounds so funny to say, but it's like anything else, right? We can cultivate a false sense of authenticity that makes us look really good and makes us seem really approachable. But, throwing it back to the faith communities, that's exactly why you see these mega churches with people who are unbelievably two-faced, to say the least. And you realize, wow, they are not who I thought they were, but they said all the right things and they taught all the right classes. And you realize, yeah, it's easy to do when you are incredibly capable of nuance and cultivating a false authenticity. And so I say that that's what came out of podcasting for me, because I realized I don't want to be that guest for people either. And so when I do get the honor of showing up on someone else's conversation platform, I just want to make sure that what I bring is not curated. Like, yeah, sure, there's a bio that I can rattle off of my head, top of my head, but I want to make sure that we're bringing something real and something meaningful and valuable into the world instead of just creating noise. Because, I mean, you probably know as well as I do, Dom, there are a lot of podcasters that are creating noise and just regurgitating someone else's content and not actually intending to affect change for the people that they've got the ability to influence. And so those are the things. That's what I've learned.
Me like you. That's right indeed. Me like you indeed. Yeah, it was actually funny when you mentioned the third point about the whole and mentioned the mega church. Is actually reminded me of a past guest, Antonio T. Smith, in one of his webinars for his group. He mentioned like, yep, if you want to learn about church folk and get their business, talk with them for an hour.
Yeah.
Because after about a good 40, 50, 60 minutes, the real them will pop out.
Yeah. You can only keep up the facade for so long. And I think that that's one of the most beautiful parts of, honestly, about the grief process, is realizing that there's no one that you owe anything to except yourself. Like, you owe your authentic self to who you are, because when you face grief head on, like when you truly say, all right, I'm going to face this, I'm going to look at who I am, stuff surfaces that's scary, that are old untended wounds that you didn't realize were affecting the way you move through the world. You have these, predispositions to self-protection or guarding yourself against other people asking too many questions or getting too close. And you realize that one little thread of grief that you've pulled really has affected so many areas of your life. And so you have this new opportunity to decide, well, am I going to pull that thread and really become humble, as I am being honest about who I am and why, without shaming myself, without that narrative of, well, if only you did this, you would be better. Or if maybe you tried this, things wouldn't be so gross for you. Like, we are all gross. We all have areas in our lives that we've denied, that we have said, this doesn't hurt as bad as it does, because if I admit that it hurts, then it means that I'm weak in that area. And I'll just, to wrap up, that was one thing that I've learned the most out of my own grief process, but even just working with clients, every single one of them that is told, oh my gosh, you're so strong. Like, I'm a strong individual. I get told that often. It makes me so tired, because I'm tired of being so strong. I'm tired of everyone looking to me just to say, like, oh, you're the one we're looking at. Don't look at me. I've cultivated, like, you're not my inner circle. You are seeing part of my story. And sure, hold that part as a role model, but don't hold me on a pedestal, because I will disappoint you. Hell, if I find out I'm on a pedestal in your life, I'll go out of my way to disappoint you, to prove a point that every one of us is flawed and deserves all the grace and permission we need to explore those flaws and embrace them as beautiful and important and necessary and informative and meaningful for the person we are becoming.
Heck yeah. That's right indeed. That's right indeed. That's right indeed. That's right. Mandy isn't about the gun show all the time. She's like, yeah, gotta keep this covered, y'all. Y'all can't see these guns all the time, dang it. That's right indeed. And that kind of reminds me of a beautiful thing about Christ himself, where he's like, hey, he didn't come to sit on the throne of earth. He came to fulfill his destiny. Like, that's the thing. It's like,
Mhm.
hey, like, don't even why you call me good master? It's like, hey, let's focusing on making sure the main thing is the main thing, and not treating humans like they're
Yeah.
gods. Like, that's impossible.
Yeah.
Like, that's just asking for it. Next thing you know, you're drinking Kool-Aid, and then you wake up with a lampshade over your head. It's like, what the heck? Like, you don't want to do that. So my goodness, so such a cool load of interviews. Is there a question that you wish folks would ask you more often?
Hmm. A question I wish people would ask more often. It's hard to sort through because I do get so many different questions. I'm thinking, oh, every time I hear one, I'm like, that's such a good question. And I used to write a column called Ask a Grief Coach, and I would just take those questions and answer them in like an Dear Abby format, generalizing things. And so every single time someone even asks a question, I'm exhilarated. So I think that's my answer. It's not there's a specific question, because that's going to change based on what you're carrying, but ask a question. Ask a question without fear of being told, oh, what a stupid question. Like, yeah, there are stupid questions in the world, but when it comes to grief, I don't think they really apply. I think whatever you're curious about gives you permission to gain some new ground as you're healing and as you're becoming this new version of self and new ball of energy in the world. I think being curious and compassionate towards ourselves is what raises our energy levels. Metaphysically speaking, but also like just energy wise, when you wake up in the morning, that is something that we don't necessarily honor. And so I think asking questions in general, any question, even if it's as simple as, am I doing this right? Or am I doing this wrong? Or what do I do next? Or how do I even get started? Or is it supposed to feel like this? Or I don't know what this feeling is. Can you help? Or what resources should I read? Or what resources should I avoid? Like, there's so many different questions that have very different answers, because if I'm working with someone who is a humanist and has no faith background, my book is the last piece I'm going to refer them to. I would never. Actually, that's one of my favorite things about this book specifically. When it first came out, I had a friend who is working as a bereavement coordinator in a hospital and previously was a youth pastor, or regular grown up pastor. I can't recall, was working in the church. and working as a chaplain as well, and has become an atheist. And when I
Oh,
asked
wow.
them to read my book, because we'd been doing some work together, I said, just, trigger warning, right? Or activation warning. It's about my faith journey, but it also borrows from so many other faith practices in the book itself that it can be, chew the meat, spit out the bones, find what serves and leave the rest behind. You can take pieces of this that are meaningful. And I am unoffended if you say that the rest is irrelevant to you, because it is. You're the one who defines that. And I'll never forget, he said, I read your book in a day. It's beautiful. The only thing I would say is if there's someone who's grieving that doesn't appreciate faith, or their faith is the reason they're grieving, I wouldn't recommend it to them. I said, oh, I agree with you. And he brought a friend into a conversation on Twitter at one point and who was asking, like, had asked him, hey, is this a book I should read? He tagged me and I said the same thing. I'm like, just looking at your like Twitter life,
Yeah.
I'm going to say no, don't read my book. It will hurt
Right.
more. And I'm so grateful for his response. He said in that moment, he was like, that was the moment I knew you were legitimate and not just trying to sell a book or a program. And I was like, thank God, because that was the most authentic answer I had. I can't say, oh yeah, my book is for everyone. I'm not for everyone. Why would my book be for everyone? Why would I want it to be for everyone? Like, I don't need that. That's too much work, to be honest.
That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. She/her, direct/sassy, right?
You've got it. That's exactly it. My sibling-in-law asked me a couple months ago, or a couple years ago now, I guess, hey, what are your adjectives? And I was like, what? He's like, what are your adjectives? And I think I said direct and sassy or something like that, direct and spicy. And they were like, yeah, that tracks. That's good. I'm like, yeah, my pronouns, she, her, my adjectives, direct and spicy. Sounds right.
That's right, indeed. No jalapenos required. Ow! But that's a beautiful thing, though, and it's refreshing too, especially in this age of veneers that we're in, where a lot of folks are trying to do the whole fake it till you make it on the 10th degree level 99 styles, sadly, now, where it's like, oh, it ain't just here and there where you're trying to build us up to that point. It's like, oh, this is a whole freaking business of influencer marketing gone bad. It's like, what the heck? And
Yeah,
then we got the real deal Holyfield here, y'all. That's right, indeed. That authentic Mandy right there. That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. Gotta love the authenticity. She is the real, genuine leather. She is not pleather, y'all. That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. Or it's okay to laugh. You don't have to hold back your laughter here. if you have
you're good.
if you have groans, that's okay too. It just encourages me even more to make more puns. It's okay.
More puns and dad jokes. It's the vibe. It's all right.
Yes, indeed. Well, speaking of crazy questions, if your wonderful book, Restorative Grief, if it were a food, what would it be and why?
Oh man, it would probably be like shepherd's pie. It's like warm and accessible and affordable, and it has become this. I'm always fascinated by like rustic European dishes that were considered peasant food. Like ratatouille is another one that was actually, made because people were lacking resources and they had to use up this food. Same thing with like cured fish, all of those things that people have said like, oh, okay, but that they've elevated, chefs have said like, oh, this is this most dramatic, beautiful thing. I'm like, yeah, it's just filling. It's filling and it's restorative and it's nourishing. And anytime there's something that is balanced like that with vegetables and protein and all of the things that you need, but it also brings you this sense of comfort and fulfillment. That's the book. It's shepherd's pie.
Ah, there you go. Funny enough, you're actually the first one to refer to the book as Shepherd's Pie.
Nailed it. It's like any book you've never read.
That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. Someone's prepared for that question. That's what I'm talking about. I think the
Mhm.
only other pie, well, then again, pizza is a pie, but I'm not counting that one. The only other pie someone referred to their book was it was actually flapper pie.
Delicious. That's funny.
That's right, indeed. That means his book may have risen to the top of the bestseller list because it's a cream pie.
Maybe so. That's funny. Can't even think of the last time I had something like that.
There you go. Time for a change. Forget the calorie counting. Indulge. Well, speaking of indulging, been loving to indulge hundreds of folks with this question. So, if you're to wake up tomorrow, you're 25 again, but still in 2023, what advice would you give to yourself?
Oh man, 25. I need context. Am I experiencing my life as a 25-year-old, everything that was true then, but just now?
You got it. I love it. Folks actually listen to the question because folks be going back to, oh, yeah, if I was 25 again, I'd invest in Apple stock. Like, no, dang it. You're 25 in the current
Yeah.
year after COVID. You're freaking Gen Z
Yikes.
now.
Yeah. Shoot, if I was Gen Z now, oh, it would be spicier than it is. I'll tell you that much. To know that I had a generation behind me and alongside me that wasn't struggling as hard, that like my husband and I were just talking about this morning. Our generation has such a different pile of work to get through. That's all it feels like. Because, we're cuspers, we're Gen X millennial cuspers. And so I'm like, Jesus, we are dealing with so many things that we were set up for failure with. Like we were told, like, this is what you need to do. And we were set up to fail, not intentionally, but also not unintentionally, right? There wasn't really a truly successful path set for us. And so we're like budgeting and trying to parent and trying to reparent ourselves and going to therapy and trying to realize like, oh God, we should have been drinking organic milk because the hormones, oh, it's different and all the things, right? So I think I would be a lot mouthier and a lot less afraid of losing my status culturally, especially within the church framework, because I was I've always been a pushback person. Like if somebody's theology doesn't make sense or it's dismissive of a people group, I get really agitated and just put like to myself will be like, well, that's not of God because that's not true for every person. If that were true for every person, then it would make perfect sense. But that's really only true for the middle-class white men in the room. So I don't think that that's actually of God. I think that's of man, and that's fine. I would probably be a lot louder about that at 25, because at 25, I was a very different person. I was, newly married and trying to figure out how to be a great wife, and countering that with the idea of like, this is BS. We are 100% equal here. And I don't understand why people are telling me that my behavior, whatever it is, whatever patriarchal message I was receiving and rejecting at the time, I think I would be a lot more aggressive about it because it has caused so much harm now, looking down the road from 25 to now, just recognizing how miraculous it is that our marriage has survived and thrived, honestly, on the other side of that, because there was so many ways along or so many places along the way that it should have fallen apart if we had not fought to invite something differently, especially now as we're watching other friends of ours that got married around the same time who are going the opposite direction and recognizing this isn't what I wanted. This isn't who I am, how painful it is and how unfair it is that their foundation was so tenuous and to their detriment. It was handed to them with cracks. So, that's just the empathetic grief counselor in me too, that says this isn't what you were meant for. And it sucks that this is what you were given. I'd be a lot. Oh yeah. I would definitely, the people who listen to this, who know me, are going to be like, you would be more aggressive. God. Okay. Great. But it's true.
That's funny.
It's true.
You have like one of the most common voices ever, which is even more hilarious. It's like, oh wow, so this is the light, huh?
Right. It's funny you say that. One of my dear friends is always like, every time we talk, she's like, you should be on the Calm app. People go listen to her podcast because it's the most soothing sound. And I think it's funny because yeah, this is my real voice. It's not like I'm dropping it or doing anything different to sound differently. But when I know that I'm in a secure place or like in a secure relationship or with friends that I'm safe, right? My voice doesn't change so much as it gets really even faster, and even it'll get a lot higher, but like the laughter that comes out and just the lightheartedness, it's that release that, you know, we all deserve and we all need permission to have, but we don't necessarily get it because it's not appropriate or it's not permissible or whatever that is. And so there'll be days when I like am making new friends and just I'll drop something that's completely out of left field and just watch and be like, this is my aggressive test. Whether I ask you your deepest secret or I say something really inappropriate and unexpected, I need to know if you're with me or if you're with the idea of me. If you're here for the idea, again, I will take myself off of your platform, off of your pedestal very quickly. But if you're here for me, great. Here's the fullness. It's a mess. Good luck.
That's right, indeed. It's probably a happy mess since you're married to survive COVID. That's right, indeed, which is amazing. That's what I'm talking about. Survive the jungle in the wilderness. That's right, indeed.
Yeah.
That's I'm like, yeah, like that means it's real. It's the real deal, Holyfield, baby. That's right, indeed. And you love to see it. At least I love to see it. Love when folks get to stay together, indeed. Because hey, it's either not and everything, being parents and everything. It's like, you know what? Like, hey, if you can work it out, that's freaking awesome. It'll be a nice little example. I was like, hey, they're still alive today. They're still in each other's
Yeah.
presence. Like, use that as a part of an example. One of the many examples out there that magic can still happen. That's right, indeed.
Yeah.
Hashtag Magic Mandy. That's right, indeed. You're getting all the
It's a terrible third movie in the Magic Mike trilogy. Magic Mandy. She just yells at people and says, you need to deal with your crap.
That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. We got pooper scoops for a reason.
The first time I've ever been called a pooper scooper. Okay.
Well, you said people need to deal with their crap.
Yeah, it's true.
So take that pooper scooper, baby. That's right, indeed. Scoop it up. That's right, indeed. Well, I know folks need to scoop more of your content up for their wonderful ears. So for those who need to get more of Mandy before they miss you like candy, what's the best way for folks to do so?
Well, my website's mandicapehart.com, CAPEHART, or I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Mandy Capehart, and I'm active on both. So all of my grief resources, the podcast, the Restorative Grief Project, you can find all of it in all of those places.
Woo! Well, there you have it, folks. And I'll put a link to all that in the show notes. You heard that right, indeed. That's right, indeed. If you want more of Matt, you're going to put the links to that in the show notes because her heart has a cape, y'all. That's right, indeed. Grief counselor swag ahoy. That's right, indeed. Who needs Captain Marvelous Supergirl? We got Marvelous Mandy, y'all. That's right, indeed. This Eminem in more ways than one. So, my goodness, any parting words before we close up shop?
Just that I'm really grateful that you're willing to have this conversation. I realize that grief counselors are not exactly the most fun people to bring in and invite others to listen to. So I appreciate your willingness to do that for me, but also to invite your listeners to say, it's not going to kill you to actually look at something that hurts in your life. And it won't, like, not if you navigate this with people who care about you. And I can be counted among those people. So thanks for bringing me in.
Thanks a bunch for investing your time by listening to this wonderful podcast today. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you really did, do me a solid and leave a review or share this episode with at least 3 people that you think would get some value out of today's content. Advance others to advance yourself.